Okay, I'm with Don. Hey Don. Don, you've been
Hey,
on the
Jeff.
show. You've been on the podcast before. Um, so we'll skip all of the huge pleasantries. But give everybody an update on where your writing is. Let's start there.
Right. Well, I published it last October. I published my third and final book in my first trilogy. Um, my fourth book is currently with an editor,
Nice.
and my fifth book is with an alpha reader, or two
Okay.
actually. And the scene we're going over today is for my sixth book, which I think, about 10,000 words away from finishing.
Fantastic. That's great.
Yeah.
Is the main character in this one carried through your other books that we're gonna look at,
Yeah,
Eros?
they're all set in the same universe, just different parts of the world.
Yeah, yeah.
And the fourth book I wrote is about Eros. So this is him coming back and interacting with the characters from the first trilogy.
Nice. Just for updates, so this may have been like a year ago. You came on the podcast and talked about plotting out this long series.
Yeah,
How's it going?
it's going great.
Good.
Um, I ran into a pretty major hurdle where I just was not loving the entire concept.
Oh,
Um, and this is a concept that I've been in love with for, 15, 20 years or
yeah, it
so.
was the whole like World War II kind of replay
Yeah.
fantasy world thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So I had to take a real hard look and see what is it that is missing because there's just some big hole. You have this giant war, but what, it's a
Yeah.
war, cool, whatever. It doesn't, there's no meaning to it necessarily. And so I focused, and I think what I really found was there just wasn't the emotional draw, and there wasn't enough buildup in my mind. And it
Okay.
was like it was going straight to war. It was going to be 9 books of war, which would get pretty boring pretty
Yeah,
quick.
yeah.
And the good part is, since my first trilogy is really a backstory, um, I haven't published anything else about this world, so I can do whatever I want to with the series right now.
Yeah.
Um, so I zoomed out and I replotted and came across some really good ideas that I think solve a bunch of those problems, adds in more mystery, especially around the magic system. So I'm back in love with it.
Nice. That's great. That's really exciting. Um, you still got 9 books, or are you on like now there's gonna be like 15?
I I think it's going to probably end up being about three trilogies, including the one I already wrote. Probably three
Okay.
trilogies, maybe 4 or 5 standalone books,
Okay. Very cool.
and then a whole bunch of short stories.
Yeah, yeah. Very cool. Okay, so and in your personal life, you just opened a bar, which seems very
Yeah,
cool. I haven't been there because it's across the country, but yeah, tell us
yeah,
about that.
yeah. It's called Poor Choices Pub, for POUR, of course.
Yeah,
And we're a tap house in Vancouver, Washington, right downtown.
nice.
And it's pretty cool because the bar that was there previously, there's like a little community that's built up around it. Um, but the owners weren't really into it.
Mm,
And they wanted out. So I negotiated with them, and a group of us that go to the bar came in on it together. So it's kind of like a group of friends, a group that were already regulars at the pub, and then just upgraded it, brought in really good beer. It's very artist focused. We have a writers group on Sunday. We have live music, jam sessions, featured painters, all this
that's
kind of
super
jazz.
cool. I love it, man. That's really
Yeah,
great. Yeah,
it's a lot of fun.
congratulations. Yeah, yeah. So if you're near Vancouver, Washington, go visit Four Choices. That's great. I wish I could, but that's like a I think 34-hour drive for me. It's a long trip to go to a bar.
Not worth it?
Yeah. Totally worth it. Totally worth it. It's just the time to get there. Um, totally worth it. Okay. This is you sent me we're gonna look at a rough draft of one of your chapters that you sent to me. Talk to me about how can I left you a bunch of notes, but how can I most help you with this today?
Well, I saw a theme in some of your notes that was about the main character, Eros, being stoic,
Hmm.
which there's a degree of that I want, but it appears from your feedback that I'm missing some potential for greater emotion and maybe some greater insight or depth to the character.
Yeah, so it's interesting. The chapter is he's on a flying ship. And I say flying ship because it is like a ship that is was in the water and is now flying. And
Yeah,
I don't want people to think like, why didn't you just say plane? 'Cause it's a flying ship, literally. And
yeah.
he's the ship is going through like a storm, and then it's going and then it like starts to crash. He and his friend kind of save it. Um, so it's a really solid, like the action's written really, really well. Um, the struggle I had with it was that so we follow like the reader follows the vehicle character, right? Like we live through the experience of the vehicle character, specifically emotionally, right? Like the emotional journey of the vehicle character is replicated by the reader. Because Eros is naturally stoic, the chapter already has a like very reserved feel over it. But then also, all of these things are happening that he's just a passive observer of. So it makes the reader also a passive observer. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah. And so there's a missing because he doesn't have any emotional skin in the game. The reader is kind of left reading this like, huh, this is interesting. Because that's his stance right now in the chapter. It's like, oh, this is I would actually say his stance in the chapter as a reader, I would define it as, oh, this is irritating. That's that's kind of how they're just like, huh, this is fascinating. But there's no like real I can tell you're going for like a giant emotional swing here that's like heart beating, like Indiana Jones running out of the temple as the boulders chasing him type thing. But there's no emotional investment yet. So there's just a kind of like, all right, I hope he makes it. Am I
yeah,
making sense?
yeah. And I can see where that's coming from too, because and this is a bigger issue that I'm facing with doing a large series is I wrote the fourth book and that takes place, a year before this chapter, maybe
Okay.
two. And so in my head, like I've already gotten all this stuff out. You know why he's in this motion, all this stuff about him. But this reader doesn't actually know any of that.
Yeah.
And so I think like in my head, it's like, well, his wife was slaughtered or killed. He tried to get revenge. It didn't work out. He got captured. He's a slave now, and so all this big emotions. But I don't think I do anything to bring that forward in this chapter.
Yeah, I don't feel any big emotions for him. Like let's look at an example. Um he's being yelled at to toss a dead man overside. So a body leaned against his shoulder, the frozen corpse of an older man who died moments before. Of 600 slaves that cluttered the deck and stuffed the lower quarters, only 400 remained alive. Many had fallen to illness, others to malnutrition, mishaps, or executions. Why the slavers were so careless with their product, Eris didn't know. So already we have this kind of like you give me this beautiful paragraph of this like he's in these horrific circumstances, but then Eros's response is like, I don't know. And so it's almost like, he was in the prison camp and everyone was starving and dying. Why didn't they feed the prisoners better? Eros had no idea. Right? Like it's kind of like a dude, like where are you at here? And then this guy yells at him, pointy ears, toss the old man overboard. We need to lighten our load before the ice sinks us. Eros glared back, the dark clouds turning misty to dusk. He could barely make out the man's face in the torrent. Move or you'll fly. This is great writing, by the way. Move or you'll fly too, the sailor shouted, striding forward and stumbling as the ship launched. Arrows considered the command. So again, we've got him in this passive place where he's like thinking about what's going on with no emotion. He's like, huh, do I want to throw that guy over? The old man was already dead after all. And yet, something about the unforgiving cold stole his patience. So you've got him in a slave ship where there's 200 dead bodies or 200 people have died. He's chained up. the dead body next to him is leaning on him. And when we get to throw it over the side, he's like, I don't know, it's cold. Does that make sense? Like there's it's just like some like there's some real like intense like this is intense stoicism. This guy, he's a master of stoicism. Yeah. Is that how you want him, or is that just, first draft struggles?
Mostly first draft struggles. I do want him a little stoic. He's 133 years old. He's been through war. He's seen a lot.
Okay.
Um, so there is a degree of like I've seen, been there, done that type of stoicism, or gone through a lot of pain. And you kind of learn to deal with it one way or another.
Yeah.
But what you find out in this throughout the beginning of the book is that he's hell bent on making it back to the world he came from to take
Okay.
down a boss guy who's going to take over the world kind of thing. So he's actually really driven to do something. He's got vengeance in his heart and sense of honor, sense of fear, all these emotions.
Gotcha. Is there at this moment on the slave ship, is he it doesn't sound like right now he's coming off as kind of resigned. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't sound like like you want him resigned. It sounds like you want him kind of angry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
I there's a
Simmering more than stoic,
Yeah,
maybe.
there's a couple ways I would suggest kind of editing this opening then. Your first two paragraphs are fantastic. They set a fantastic scene, right? Like you really do a great job of creating an emotional tone with the setting, which is really hard to do. Like a lone slaving vessel once sea-bound, floated above the land, heading toward a pass of the mighty Broken Mountains. A massive ship the size of ocean-faring galleon, it groaned in agony, prisoners to the enraged storm that now ravaged its sails. As rain whipped through the air, freezing against the deck, the ropes and the beards of the rugged sailors who frantically scurried about the ship, knocking sheets of ice free. That's like fantastic. Like I have a really good picture of kind of where we are. You then describe kind of where Eros is. He's shackled together. One thing you could do is give him more interaction with this corpse.
Mm-hmm.
Have it bump against him, have him like shove it back in anger, and then have him make a mental note that he's not actually mad at the old man's dead body. He's mad at being on the ship, but small irritations like this might just push him over the edge, right? Then you can tell me like the 600 cluttered on the deck. Only 200 remained. Give me a sentence about his determination that he would not be one of the nameless ones thrown overboard, or one of the nameless ones on this death galley. He was going to make it out and make it back to revenge such and such. And now we've got like kind of an emotional tapestry of where he is. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
How does that feel?
I like that a lot. One person who in one of my writing groups who read through this said how it's an exciting scene. There's lots of cool stuff happening. It's visually cool, but they didn't feel invested.
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, and the reason we don't feel invested is because Eros doesn't seem invested. And so the more you can
Yeah.
like ground him emotionally in what's happening, the more we're going to feel invested in the scene. I don't think you need to edit the action at all. I think the action's fantastic. I just want Eros put in like this line here. Eros considered the command. The old man was already dead after all. And then I'd add a line like, so this wasn't about a moral dilemma, right?
Hmm.
And yet something about the unforgiving cold stole his patience. Why should he have to stand up and throw this man overboard? Right? Like, who was this man to command him? Right? Like, give me like a little more like like frustration. And then maybe even like if you add the like body beating against him a little more earlier, give him like another line about like, he couldn't decide what he was angrier at. The screaming sailor or the corpse that was leaning against him once again, right? Like give him a little like more pulling us. It's pulling us with those things. It's pulling us into the moment emotionally that like makes the scene come alive. Even though your
Hmm.
descriptions are fantastic, they really are. They're really great. Um,
Thank you.
There's a couple places in here where, and I'm sure these come from other books, and this is always a struggle, man. Like, how often do you define when you're in book five? Do you still have to be defining like roles and stuff? So the Quinn is one of them, and then later you have a phrase, variance.
Mhm.
Are these defined in the other books?
Yeah.
Okay.
But that being said, there's a really good chance that this book will be the first book that people read
Mm,
because of the first trilogy being a backstory and book four being a standalone. Um,
gotcha.
I think there's a good chance they won't have read those first four books.
Okay. Are these like, is the Quinn and variants like monsters in the world? Are they creatures? Like, how do these words work for you?
So a Quinn is a race. It's a species,
Okay.
very tall, white-skinned, narrow, and variance is kind of like my wizards in a way.
Okay.
So they're able to control the magic in the world essentially, which is based on a material called varium.
Okay. Gotcha.
So a variant is somebody who can manipulate variant.
Yeah. Have you already come up with a lot of times long series like these will have like a phrase or a sentence that describes creatures or like world building elements that they can just use over and over again at the first of every book to kind of help people
Mm.
recall like this is what it is. Um, have you already written those somewhere? Like, do you have those?
Uh, yeah, I mean, I don't have them like specifically written down in a specific area, but I throughout the books I've got that.
Okay. It can help. Like when I've worked with fantasy authors before, especially epic fantasy authors like you, it can help to have like, if you're just keeping a Google Doc that's like the Quinn. Well, I did this when I was writing urban fantasy. I'd have like Marduk, and then I'd have like the five sentences in the first two books I'd use to describe them, so that I could, when I was writing book three or four, I could just pull one of those sentences and like bring it into book four. Be like, hey, this is what this is. And I didn't have to like, and it's interesting. The repetition of it is, I find is actually helpful to readers because it's like a quick recall. It's not enough to make it feel like, oh crap, we're describing these things again. You're just looking for like a sentence to be like, so I might have here like, because this is the first time, and I'd only do this the first time I'm using the word in a book, but like now's not the time. I'd use her name, Valen, said said Valen sitting next to him, her dual voice low. As a Quinn, she was blah 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 blah. His friend for more than a century, she'd surrendered herself when he'd been captured. So that like you just want that like one sentence to be like, this is what it is.
Yeah,
Yeah, or like the first time you introduce the variant, right? The two variants leapt from the Inferno, and immediately the field flickered and vanished in a flash of luminescent smoke, using their blah blah blah. These variants, were able to blah blah blah, right? Like giving us like a line of like description of who they are. And then the quick cheat is like, hey, if you can keep those lines, you could just use them over and over again. Um, the most effective version I've seen of this, like in the wild, quote unquote, is in Harry Potter. You can track every time she introduces a reoccurring character because she has almost the exact same sentence around those characters. Like Hagrid is introduced the same way every time he's introduced, and
interesting.
it's a great trick because you don't like reading it. It kind of triggers that like inner memory of what you've read, but it doesn't feel like it's copy and paste, even though it might be.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I never picked up on that before.
Yeah. It's a good,
It,
and so that would like the problem I had reading is that once I read the variant, that I didn't know what this meant because I haven't read your other books. And so once I read it, understanding who these two people are is actually really important for the rest of the chapter. So I was
Yeah.
like, I don't know what's happening. But now that you tell me they're wizards, the whole chapter makes sense. I'm like, oh, I get what's happening now. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
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 Yeah. And
There's
I, oh, yeah, go for it. Sorry.
there's a I won't name the author because I'm being critical of him, but there's an author who writes really giant epic fantasies. Um, and he has these incredible world building, excuse me, magic systems. And but one of the things that drives me nuts is he continually repeats himself so much that you're like, I get it, I get how it works.
Yeah.
But he's repeating himself in one book over and over versus
Yeah.
repeating yourself from book to book just to jog people's memories.
Yeah. And I don't need the repetition. Like, I haven't read the books, but I was watching Wheel of Time with my 18-year-old last night on Prime. And there's this one character who keeps saying the same prophecy over and over again. And my 18-year-old just said, oh, neither of us are fantasy readers. So it's a weird show for us to watch because we're not like Robert Jordan fans. But my 18-year-old said in the middle of it, he's like, if she says one more time that he was born of the blood but is not of the blood, I'm turning this off. I was like, yeah, I know. I was like, this is epic fantasy. You just gotta like lean into it. But so yeah, yeah, they're doing a great job in the show. It's just really funny to have like a non-fantasy reader, like the repetition sometimes of like the fantasy.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think I would when I was writing like when I was writing the like supernatural detective novels, I found this hard too, that I didn't want to have to explain Mo, my lead detective. I didn't want to have to explain her powers every time she used them. So like I had like a couple phrases at the start of the book when she first used it. I had like I don't remember them anymore, but I had like two sentences that were like one sentence explained what she was doing, one sentence explained the cost to her. I'd use it the first time she used them, and then for the rest of the book, I was like, okay, I'm good to go. But like you were saying, just that because those books, well, they weren't supposed to, but I can't help myself. They had like a ongoing plot, but I tried to write them so that you could pick one up whenever you wanted and just read whichever one in the series you wanted first. But I found what you're talking about difficult is like, how often do I have to explain this quote unquote magic system? Because it's,
Yeah.
yeah, because the
Yeah.
reader needs to know it, right? Like, especially in this chapter, I need to understand what these people are doing on the ship and why they're important. Um, and they have to be supported. Yeah, anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. That's really helpful.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on that?
Um, no, I think it's basically going in and doesn't sound like any major surgery. It's just adding a
No.
line here or there. Um, show a little bit more inside of Eros's head and heart versus just what he's actually doing.
Yeah, I don't think you need any major surgery in here. I didn't find anywhere where I was like, oh my gosh, we got to cut this thing up. I think it's all really great. Like, and there's things you're doing in here, man, that are really hard to do that are really good. Like, for example, I highlighted this section here because you've got this great action scene where like the sails kind of fall is crashing down and men are racing around and things are going wild. And what I love about what you're doing that a lot of authors miss is that you're keeping people talking during it, which
Mm-hmm.
is the vocalization and how people are interacting with each other is what carries the emotional tone of the scene. If
Mm-hmm.
it's just actions without people interacting either through voice or like through nonverbals with each other, then the emotions drop out of the scene and you do a really great job of keeping it in. Like Eros heard the captain's voice above the fray, drop the sail, hurry. Men raced around the deck, pulleys, wheels spinning as furiously tried to lower the sail. One corner of the canvas tore free. It struck a sailor dangling high above, sending him flailing into the wind. Take it down before it hits the field, cried the captain. Of the 20 sails that commanded the vessel, three held it afloat. So, action moments in this, the men racing around the deck, right? one corner of the canvas breaking free, 20 sailors commanding the vessel, three are holding it. 20 sails commanding the vessel, three are holding it afloat. Those are the like images that are painting something. You've textured in, drop the sail, hurry, take it down before it hits the field, cried the captain. You've textured those pieces in, and by like bringing out, like taking a beat to give me that screaming from the captain, you add emotional resonance to it. Does that make sense? It's really great. Like, I see so many like fight scenes or action scenes where people all of a sudden everybody stops talking and it's like fight scenes for some reason happen in silence. It's like, why are we
Yeah.
silent? But like the talking through the scene really brings that like emotional pop in. It's really great. Uh yeah, and it kind of it is hurting you here though because the captain and the sailors are really emotional, but Eros is like chill. So it's not like you're actually the contrast is actually hurting you a little bit, but once you bring Eros out, I think it'll be good. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, it looks good. Like here's another piece. Eros' stomach lurched as the ship dropped. Put that fire out, commanded the captain. Immediately, the men ripped soaked and freezing blankets from the slaves to smother the fire, leaving the poor bodies exposed to the deadly cold. Light the fucking sail, roared the captain as the ship continued to sink. So, like, having this action driven by the dialogue of the captain
Mhm.
makes it emotionally tangible. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that just naturally coming out of you? Are you writing dialogue draft first? Like how are you getting what's your process for pulling these action scenes together?
I I think it's kind of natural at this point, but when I first started writing, I saw kind of the two extremes was one where there's a fight where nothing's happening. It's a long action scene, not where nothing's happening, where no one's saying anything.
Yeah.
And those don't feel realistic because in real fights, people are yelling and insulting and doing all kinds of things. Where on the opposite side, and you see this in Marvel movies sometimes, where they're in the middle of a battle and then all of a sudden they're slowing down to kiss or have a full conversation.
Yeah, that's
And
also
you're like,
weird. It's out of emotional sync. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So the way I was seeing it is, if we're looking at rhythm, an action scene needs to be an upbeat, fast rhythm. It can't be a chill, laid back groove. And so I've got to break up the action and the dialogue in a way that gives it that staccato
Yeah.
punch. You know?
Yeah, yeah. You're doing a great like I love as an example that I think a lot of us know is in The Princess Bride, the initial sword fight
Yeah.
between Wesley and Inigo Montoya. And it's that like the amount of talking that they do in that sword fight is A, fantastic, and B, like really demonstrates what you're talking about. Like watch that sword fight with the volume off. And it's
Mm-hmm.
very different. It's a very different experience. And it's kind of boring. But when you watch it with the volume on, it's like a one of the most classic action scenes, I think, in cinema. So it's that like understanding that like, oh, this is the yeah, it's funny you bring up the Marvel movie. I what immediately came to mind is the Age of Ultron movie that has two very different action sequences in that. One is the opening action sequence where they're all joking with each other. They're laughing with each other about how Captain America says a bad word at some point. Nobody's really stressed. It's all really chill. And it's got a weird feeling to it because they're literally killing people, but they're just like, no big deal. And then you get the second huge one in which, they have a fight in this like I don't know, secret lab. But then I guess it's the third fight in that movie. There's the fight between Robert Downey Jr. and the Hulk, where
Mm-hmm.
Robert Downey Jr. is also talking through the whole fight, but it's in emotional congruousness with the like tension that's happening. And so
Mhm.
it adds to the emotion in a positive way. Does that make sense? Like it's that
Yeah,
like getting that conversation in sync with what's happening in the action, I think is really important for the emotional tone you're going for. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I used to do like 20 years ago. I used to do and perform beat poetry.
Oh, really? I didn't
Um,
know that.
yeah, yeah. And I've been wanting to just practice writing beat poetry again, because I haven't been motivated to. But I learned a lot in writing that kind of poetry about rhythm and,
Interesting.
build, 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 and then punch, 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 build, punch,
Yeah.
and kind of find it because it's such a performance thing that, there's a literal audio rhythm to it.
Yeah.
So I kind of want to get that back in the system.
Yeah. And I think, it's a fun way to craft a character voice because the like musicality of the rhythm of grammar can actually distinguish characters from one another. So,
Yeah,
like a more commanding character is going to have like, probably in a conversation is going to have like short sentence, listening, listening, short sentence, listening, listening, short sentence, listening, listening, and then like three or four sentences together to
right.
show. And like what that cadence does is shows like, oh, I'm listening, interacting, and then making a determination. So it makes the character feel more commanding. Where like a playful character might have like, kind of paragraph up front, and then as the conversation goes on, decrease the amount of interaction to just like one-liners and jabs as the conversation builds, right? Like so you can get that like common cadence of your characters going. It can give you a good pattern for writing scenes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that makes sense.
And it builds a different what's really nice is once you start to get those cadences down, you can actually manipulate the energy of scenes by what characters you bring into them. So like
Hmm.
if you want characters that contrast each other, get that talkative, like teasing character in with the commanding character because you've got one character that's talking a lot up front and another that's holding their conversation till the end. It really draws the contrast in between the two of them. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Like, yeah.
yeah. In fact, in my first book, when I was going through the editing process, my line editor actually is the one who identified that I have these two characters that are, uh, they're antagonists to each other, but they're being forced to work together.
Hmm.
And one of them, the guy, is a theatrical, over the top, larger than life type person. And so he's always got these long sentences. He talks too much. And the other character who's opposite to him, she's always short worded, usually cussing, very
Hmm.
abrupt. But at some point in this conversation, it suddenly flipped. And she was using long sentences and elaborating more on things and using more descriptors. And he was being short. And so
Interesting.
it completely threw the scene off. And I couldn't figure out why the scene didn't, it felt off to me, but it had all the right elements to it, had turning points and choices and consequences and everything.
Hmm.
But but the characters lost their distinction, and thereby it ultimately kind of lost some of the tension just by doing that.
Interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. Um, and I love that you're aware of that and like watching the how those cadences are playing out. Does that make sense?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, Another thing I didn't get and it doesn't necessarily always have to happen in the first chapter, but how is Eros going to need to grow and change in this story? Because I couldn't get a
Um,
handle on that in here.
yeah. So right now, at the beginning of the story, he's driven mostly by anger and vengeance
Okay.
for the loss of his wife. But by the end of it, he's kind of sort of moved beyond that. He still wants his revenge, but it becomes overshadowed by this sort of new community that he's come across and realizing that they're all going to be in danger as well in the future. And so he needs to sort of pick up this mantle as someone who can go back and sort of make things right, or at least combat
Gotcha.
the Dark Lord, as it were.
So he's moving from like, I mean, I don't know that it's using this word is the best word to use, but like a selfish focus to a communal focus
Yeah,
in the story. Like
yeah.
does he have to sacrifice his desire for revenge in order to support the community at some point? Like, does he have to like put it off in order to? That's kind of a trope in those growth arcs is like he has the opportunity to kill the dude, but killing the dude would like actually hurt the community. So he's like, I'll get you
Right.
later. Does that occur in the plot at any point?
Well, his actual moment of revenge will be many books in the future,
Okay.
but he does by the end of the book is sacrificing himself or putting himself in danger. You know, he doesn't actually sacrifice himself, but he goes to the actions of it to save the others, despite the fact that that would mean his wife wouldn't receive her, her vengeance or justice.
Okay.
So he chooses them over that in those moments.
Okay. I think if you can work in early in here, and again, I would probably start working it in right at the beginning, but you can push it down a little bit. His desire in here to survive above all else so that he can seek his vengeance. That's going to set up right away for the reader a like, oh, this is how this guy's going to grow and change. Does that make sense? And
Yeah,
that like adding that, it actually becomes a hook. Like it feels like, wait, do I want to give it away? Do I want to give the game away that early? When it comes to character growth, you do. You want us defining this guy by like, how does he need to change? It's the save the cat thing. It's like, give us his from the very beginning, from the first scene we see him in, give us his brokenness. How is it that this guy needs to be fixed? Because the desire to see him fixed is ultimately what's going to keep us reading, and
right,
it's going to set the tone for the emotional journey. So the plot matters a lot less than the characters journey. I was actually talking with JP last night about a Ray Bradbury book, Zen: The Art of Writing, and in that he has a thing that's like the plot are just the footprints in the sand that the reader has left behind as the reader is traveling with the characters growth and change, something of that nature. So it's like that. I got the end of that wrong, but you get the idea. The
yeah,
character growth is what's like key and what the reader's actually following. So it is the most important world building you do in the whole book. And so like getting it out early, having him obsess over it in early chapters like this one sets the tone and when he starts to change and when he sacrifices toward the end of the book, because you set it up early and then hammered it hard, that sacrifice means a lot. Does that make
right.
sense?
Yeah. And in fact, like I said, I'm at the tail end of the first draft or rough draft of this one. And already I know instinctually that the character arcs, they're there, but they're just not profound enough. They're in the background. And
Yeah.
there's this, there's a kind of a lack of heart because of it, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
It does. It makes perfect sense. I've been reading a lot of Philip K. Dick this year, just to kind of learn from his writing. And it, it's fascinating. It's somebody who builds like extremely complex worlds of like, the kind of Blade Runner world that he built. It's post-apoc. It's like things are dissolving into kibble. There's a weird religion in the book that like everybody's following. That's like this really strange. Or I read Solar Lottery, which is like his big epic, one of his big epic fantasies. And the president of the universe is called the Game Master. And the minute somebody's elected president, uh, there's a game that starts where an assassin is drawn by lottery, and then that assassin's trying to kill the president, and the Secret Service are telepaths who like are looking for the assassin coming. Like there's this giant world he's built.
Right.
The amount that he explains is incredibly small, but you don't. Part of the reason his books work is because you're there for the character journey. And like in the first chapter of Blade Runner, I can't tell you why this guy hunts androids. I can't tell you that I learned later that androids only live for like 3 years and then they literally disintegrate because their cells don't rebuild. I can't tell you that in the first. I can't really tell you what it means that he's a cop or a bounty hunter. I can't tell you why the world is in devastation. I can't even explain to you why he has an electric sheep on the top of his roof. I can't tell you any of that. Or why he and his wife look into this emotional box to like calibrate their emotions. It's all stuff I'm kind of learn as the book goes on. What I can tell you though is that he's really unhappy with his life. He's living in a constant state of comparison and judgment with his neighbors. He and his wife have a broken relationship, and she's super dissatisfied with who she is and how their life is going. And he's desperate to get a large amount of money to get a real animal on top of his roof instead of a fake one. And so right from the first chapter, there's so much about the world. I have no idea what's going on. But what I do know is exactly what this character is going to have to overcome. And
Right.
that's where like that's the heart of the book. All of the like world building, the cool android fights, the weird tests he does that he doesn't even trust to decide whether this person he's about to kill is a person or an android. He's got no idea. All of that is superfluous to the character's growth. And like what
Right.
needs to be hard here for Eros and part of the like missing component around how Eros feels about all of this is it's not just about how he feels. How he feels needs to demonstrate how he's broken and how he's going to grow in the end of the book. And there's a delight for the reader in understanding like, oh, this is how this guy needs to change. I'm excited to see what happens, how that works.
Right.
Does that make sense? Like, going back to the Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, I don't know how the main character and his wife are going to fix their relationship, or even if they are, but I'm excited to see it, right? Like,
Right.
I don't know who his wife is going to become, but when she tells him, "Hey, today instead of making our box that that regulates our emotions, make me happy, I'm going to make it. I'm going to grieve today." And the guy's like, "Why would you do that?" And she's like, because I want to feel something real. I'm like, oh, I'm fascinated to see how this comes out. I don't need to know how the box works, why they're using it, why they don't just feel things naturally. None of that's explained. All I know is that she's going to go on a journey of grief, and he's like, that's stupid. And I'm here for that, right? Like, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we kind of
Yeah,
need some
absolutely.
of that with Arrows. Like, I don't even need to know who he's getting revenge on and why. I don't need to know. I just need to know that like he is hell bent on murdering someone, and that's all he cares about. His personal
Right.
safety only matters because if he dies on this ship in this shipwreck, he does not get to kill this dude. That's all I need to know. Right? Like it's the
Yeah.
emotional op of like, I've got to save this damn ship. I don't want to stand up and throw this man overboard because I might also go overboard and then I don't get to kill what's his name. And that's like all I need to know. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, going back to our Princess Bride example, we don't know the story about Inigo Montoya's father and how he was a sword maker who was like killed by a guy he made a sword for until like halfway through the movie. All we know is that he keeps asking people, do you have six fingers on your left hand?" Like that's all we know because he's looking for the six-fingered man. And we're like, man, I wonder if he's gonna find him. But it's not the fact that he's looking for a man that matters to us. It's like his passion and wanting to find this guy that we care about. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, that was a big rant.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
Oh no, that was great. Yeah, the if the I feel like maybe what we're saying is if it's almost like leaning on the action to imply emotion versus actually revealing some emotion and letting that drive the action.
Yeah, I think we get plot and story confused. I think we think what the story is a series. We think it's a series of events couched in a specific world that the reader is going to experience. But that's not what story is. Story is characters growing and changing in some way, characters going on an emotional journey that we're going to join them in. That's your story. The story isn't, you know, Eros goes here and then goes here and then goes here and then goes here. The story is Eros, hell bent on getting revenge, is willing to sacrifice everything to find and murder the man who killed his wife until he founds a community that actually needs him. Right? Like
Yeah,
that's the story. The flying ship, the wizards, all of that. Those are just the like architecture by which you tell the story. But you
mhm,
could take them out and put in new architecture and have the same story.
right.
Does that make
Yeah,
sense? And like the reader showing up for the story and is entertained by the architecture, but it's the story the reader's there for. And so the story has to be the emotional journey of the character has to be so you have to spend twice as much time on the this isn't a true number. You have to spend twice as much time on the emotional journey of the character as you do on explaining the magic system.
right,
Because the magic system doesn't actually matter. If people wanted to read
right.
magic systems, they'd read like our books would all just be textbooks about how magic
Yeah,
systems work, right? Like, or you think like I think the classic urban fantasy of the Dresden Files. The Dresden Files, the first book, if I'm remembering correctly, Dresden people don't come for me. If I'm remembering correctly, the first book starts with Dresden in a field with a pizza, trying to trick fairies into giving him information. What 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 hooks us into the book isn't that there's fairies. That there's fairies want pizza is kind of funny. But what hooks us into the book is Dresden's intense disdain for his own life and for the magical creatures around him. That's what hooks us in. Man, this guy hates his life and all of this magic happening around him. That's fascinating. That's what we want. The
yeah,
grumpy Dresden, can he find happiness in like solving crimes? That's our that's our goal. And so like it's that deep connection to him and like his and the opening scene tells us right away. This guy's isolated in a grump who's really unhappy with his life. And by to show you how he's going to find fulfillment, we're going to do it in this weird architecture of fairies that eat pizza. Right? Like it's not like here we go. Do we need the fairies to eat pizza? No, they're just for fun. What we need is Dresden being a broken grump that we have to fix. Right? Like that's what actually
right.
gets us in. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes me think about also one of the challenges of writing a long series is there's the overall arc of the character that might take, the full 9 books or the full trilogy.
Yeah.
But then each book needs kind of its own mini arc, or
Yeah.
at least an arc that's clear enough to progress to the next one, which that's going to
Yeah.
be a challenge, I think.
Yeah, if you think about like I do think that like George R. R. Martin with his Game of Thrones series has been I think a real like master of this where we can think like if we think about like okay, like let's just pick it like Dany's Targaryen, right? Like when we meet her initially, she is the silent sister of a whiny brat brother who believes who's in exile and believes he should be king. That's how we meet her first. And then she is the wife of the put upon wife of a barbarian horde leader, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then she is the female barbarian horde leader. And then she is the coming revolutionary who seems to be gathering a following in the desert. And it's not until we get to the latter books that she's the mother of dragons.
Right.
But what's
Yeah, she
beautiful,
builds.
yeah, what's beautiful about epic fan, and like we could do that with every character in that story. What's beautiful about that series is, or what's beautiful about epic fantasy in general is the longer the story you tell, the more room for transformation you have.
Mm,
So you can take characters in epic fantasy from nothing to everything because you have a lot of runway, right?
right.
In a thriller, like if you're writing a Grisham novel, if you're writing The Firm, you're writing an ambitious attorney who thinks he's going to make his life perfect and complete by taking a wealthy job in Mississippi, um, to an ambitious attorney who really wants a full and complete life, realizing that ethics matter. Not you don't have a lot of runway, right? Like
Right.
you're making one change. But with epic fantasy, we can take like Arya Stark as the ignored younger sister of a vibrant family to Arya Stark, the shape-shifting assassin who travels the world killing people who have wronged her. Right? Like
Yeah.
giant change. We see her like start to find her own voice. We see her become a swordsmith. We see her get lost in another continent. We see her have to train and become this like different person. And then we see her come back to the world she was in. You can't do that in 60,000 words. You
Yeah.
almost need 500,000 words to pull that off. Does that make sense? Like,
Yeah.
yeah, to have a comprehensive. So what's beautiful about what you're doing, like the long storytelling, is that like by the end of the story, Eros can be a completely different person because you've got like 12 books to tell his story in. So you've got like
Right.
tons of runway. But the hard thing is that if he sits in revenge for 3 books and like that's his driving, the reader's gonna be like, come on, man, this guy's got to grow
Yeah.
somehow. He's got to change, right? Like we need to see, or like going to your World War II narrative, just to give you another example, like the Band of Brothers book slash movie, we see the lead captain go from like just one of the guys in boot camp to starting to take leadership to being this really incredible leader in the unit to finally becoming like a leader of leaders. And
Right.
that's what makes that story great. And when that character disappears, people actually kind of stop watching because he's what we're watching for, right? Like he's the one that we're watching change. And it's that like getting into that like again like epic storytelling through a whole war, you have the ability to really take people to huge places.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Um, any other thoughts on that? Anything else?
I don't think so. This was really helpful.
Oh, good.
Um, I like how we went all the way down to the tactical level of, you know, sentence structure, essentially, when
Of
dialogue's
course.
happening, when it's not, and but also at the macro level of character arcs over an entire series. All that was really helpful. And I think it helps me nail down this missing thing that I'm feeling in this book right now.
Yeah, I think if I were where you are, I've written a couple books that are prequels and I'm starting off the big one, I'd be like, okay, who are my vehicle characters and in what ways can I like really take them somewhere? Because that's
Yeah.
the beauty of what you're doing is you have the ability to like just take people on this massive epic journey of change. And it doesn't all have to be like from zero to king, right? Like sometimes we take people the other direction. They go from like, I mean, I would argue, I don't think this happened in the movies, but I would argue the plot, I didn't watch them, but I would argue in Game of Thrones, Sansa Stark's plot arc is actually from innocent and naive to villainous. And like
Yeah.
the missing books, I really was hoping she'd become a monstrous villain. by the end of the thing. Because that's where she's headed, right? Like she's mentoring. By the time we finish in the books with her, she's mentoring under Littlefinger, and you're like, oh,
Yeah,
she's she's going to become dangerous, and that's kind of what you want is like her becoming this. So it doesn't always have to be a positive growth arc. Like you can take these people, you can start with people that seem like heroes, and then take them to really dark
yeah,
places, and we love it. Like it's great.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, don't do what
Awesome.
George R. R. Martin does. He keeps killing them though before they get anywhere. They're all dying
Yeah,
all the time. Yeah,
he's kind of an abusive writer. Like he he loves to just make you fall in love with someone and then kill
and
them.
just
And
murder them. Yeah, and then you can
yeah,
tell as a writer he feels bad about it, so he like brings them back. Like he kills Mama Stark, and then all of a sudden she's like underground as like this like weird judge who's like resurrected, and you're like, no, no,
yeah,
no, you broke my heart when you killed her in the Red Wedding. You can't bring her back as a ghost. It does. It's not fair.
no,
Yeah.
no.
Anyway. All right, I'm gonna hit stop and we can talk a little bit more.